CCP for many years. John Kromer is a consultant, author, and lecturer who specializes in strategic planning, public agency capacity building, and program and policy development for urban communities and metropolitan regions. As the City of Philadelphia's Director of Housing from 1992 to 2001, John supervised the expenditure of more than $1 billion in public investment in support of housing preservation and development activities that improved living conditions for thousands of Philadelphia families. As a consultant since that time, he has helped design and implement housing and economic development plans for downtowns and neighborhoods in many post-industrial cities, such as Allentown and Reading, which you're all familiar with. He teaches a popular fall semester course in the politics of housing and urban development at Penn. Prior to the current book, which he's going to talk about today, he wrote a book called Fixing Broken Cities, the Implementation of Urban Reinvestment Strategies. I would like to turn it over to John at this point. John, take it away.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to speak with you today. This really won't be a book talk. It will be about elections and particularly upset elections in Philadelphia. What a great time to talk about that 2 days after Election Day. So we'll get into that a little bit. Just a little bit of background. I came to this area to go to college. After I got out, I moved to West Philadelphia and the city grew on me. So since that time, I've lived mostly in West and Northwest Philadelphia. I have been involved in a lot of nonprofit and civic groups, but from time to time, 2 interesting things sort of struck me. One was that people would occasionally mention committee people and ward leaders in the political system, but it was very difficult to find out what was actually going on. You know, there was really nothing much in writing about how they worked or how to get into them or what was going on in Philadelphia, with the exception of some newspaper coverage, a lot of which was quite good, but it wasn't the same. The second interesting thing that kind of struck me was that people who were very active in nonprofit groups and congregations of faith, to a great extent, don't get involved in grassroots politics. They don't run for a committee person, and they don't really follow that. They certainly vote. They're interested, many of them, in social activism, but there's kind of a feeling among some of them that, you know, with politics, it's different. It's kind of dirty. You know, it's not something I feel I should get involved in. So I've spent a lot of time kind of exploring what that's all about. I got elected as a committee person in West Philadelphia a long time ago. And after my stint in the public sector, I worked on a lot of political campaigns as a treasurer, campaign manager. I ran for sheriff of Philadelphia in 2011. My campaign was based on a pledge that if elected, I would reassign the staff of the sheriff's office to city agencies that were professionally staffed, such as the redevelopment authority and the law department. Needless to say, and then I would close the office and resign. That was my basic platform. Needless to say, the campaign was not a success, but it was a great experience. If we can go to the presentation, that would be good. Great, thank you. Tom will just say next when it's time to flip. So next. First, I want to talk about a couple of big upset elections that occurred in 2020. Next. One was close to where many of you live, in the 1st Pennsylvania Senate District. Lots of South Philadelphia, lots of Center City, a great part of lower North Philadelphia, Fishtown, and a little bit of Kensington. So it's a very large area of the city, as you can see. Next. Larry Farnese, who had been reelected several times, was, I think, regarded by many as kind of a moderate, middle-of-the-road politician. certainly one with deep South Philadelphia political background, and there was an investigation that occurred not long before this election, but it did not result in an indictment or any further action. Clearly saying I was never indicted is not necessarily a great way of promoting yourself, but I think in general he was respected. It was understood he's a politician, but he had been capable of getting votes from around this very large district. His opponent last May was Nikhil Saval, a self-described democratic socialist who was one of the founders of Reclaim Philadelphia, which was a group that organized in the wake of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, the first one, and decided to do campaign organizing on a grassroots level, sort of in that same spirit. Next. And look what happened. He won big time. Saval won both the machine votes, that's the left-hand bar graph, and the mail-in votes. But it wasn't even close. And Nikhil had never run before. He was noted as an author and co-founder of a literary journal, N+1. You know, clearly he did not have zero political experience. He had a lot from the Sanders campaign and from Reclaim Philadelphia, but this is quite an upset. Next. Here's an even more interesting one to me. Every 2 years, the seats in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives are open. If you're going to run for office, that's a good seat to run for because the districts are relatively small compared to, for example, the state Senate. Look at this one. This is in the Penn area. It covers Penn and Drexel. It's basically south of Market Street to the river. And a lot of those Penn influenced communities, Cedar Park, Spruce Hill, etc. You could really canvass that area pretty effectively if you had a campaign of a few months. Next. So the long-term incumbent was Jim Roebuck, a former professor at Drexel, active in community organizations, resident of the Garden Court neighborhood. I think generally well-regarded, not a high-profile guy, but somebody who I think people felt could get work done for you, who was accessible, who could talk with you intelligently, and was aware of the important issues. Next. So here's what Jim Roebuck was able to do. Here's 2016, no opponents, and he got about 3,600 votes. Next. Then in 2018, he had 2 opponents, and they helped divide up the vote. So Roebuck got a little more than he had in 2016, but that was enough for him to win decisively against those 2 opponents. Next. And then in 2020, a guy named Rick Krajewski, who had some ties to Penn, but had also been involved in Reclaim Philadelphia, was one of his opponents in the primary election for State House. Next. And here's how it stood up. Jim Roebuck did what he had done previously. He got 3,600 plus votes. And this time, the remainder of the votes were split among 3 candidates. Next. But look what happened. He got clobbered, 6,000 plus votes for Krajewski. It wasn't even close. And even with 2 other candidates splitting some of the votes, there was no question about Krajewski's victory. Look at that number, though, and the total at the very bottom line on the right, 13,000 plus. Compared to the turnout in the other 2 elections. The district hadn't been redrawn. There was no change in the boundaries of the district. So where did all those voters come from? All those Krajewski voters? I expect it's because a lot of people who had not registered in the district, who might have been students or Penn affiliated, registered, or who were renters and felt that they'd be moving out at some time and hadn't moved out yet. Or people who never voted for state representative because they had no idea who was running or what the office was all about. This time they knew, and they knew they wanted to vote for Rick Krajewski. It was quite a dramatic upset. Next. I want to mention a similar kind of upset that's described in my book. Next. It was the 2017 city controller election, the primary that took place 4 years ago. Alan Butkovitz versus Rebecca Reinhardt. Alan Butkovitz lost, as you may know, but just to provide some background that some of you may not be aware of, he was a state representative in the state house for some time, during the late 20th century, and he was a political guy, but I think he was very widely respected. He did the job, he knew the issues, he was accessible, he was responsive. So I think during that period, he was a progressive before everybody was talking about progressives. And then as a controller, again, this is a political office and he did political stuff, but I think many people would agree that his performance was more than adequate and in some cases outstanding. And his opponent was Rebecca Reinhardt, 0 prior political experience. Next. But she wiped him out. Look at the map of the wards. Reinhardt, the wards that Reinhardt won are shaded, and the Butkovitz wards are unshaded. Butkovitz comes from Northeast Philadelphia. He racked up a lot of votes in Northeast, but look at that outcome for a newcomer against an incumbent who had a quarter century of experience in politics. Next. So I was interested in finding out why these upsets happen. Is it like playing the lottery? Like, oh, I ran for a city council again this year and I got elected. Well, it's not like that. Or is it that, you had to pay somebody off and somebody engineered the voting so that you got elected? It wasn't like that either. Or, was it totally random? Was there no way of explaining it? And there are ways to explain it, and that's what my book is all about. In the city controller election, Butkovitz versus Reinhardt, there was a big opportunity because the big headline election in 2017 was for DA, as you may remember. And there were 3 really well-qualified candidates who were running. One was Larry Krasner, another was Joe Kahn, a respected former prosecutor, another was Rich Negrin, managing director during the Nutter administration. Next. Good. Rebecca Reinhardt's team knew that going to the ward leaders for their blessing wasn't going to work because Butkovitz was one of them. He'd been acquainted with them for decades. So it wasn't going to be any use for Rebecca to go out and do her pitch with the ward leaders. They weren't going to pay attention to him. Instead, they focused wisely on the primary election for DA and went to the DA candidates and said to each of them, would you list Rebecca on your sample ballot, the sample ballot that your supporters hand out at the polls on election day? And you saw a lot of that the day before yesterday. I'm sure if you voted at the polls, even if you didn't, people shoving a piece of paper in your face and asking you to pay attention to it. This really was a little bit different because there were voters who were passionate about, Joe Kahn or passionate about Rich Negrin as well as Krasner. So if somebody approached you and said, here's the Joe Kahn ballot, there's Rebecca Reinhardt down below as city controller. If somebody said, I want Rich Negrin's ballot, same thing, there it is in the upper left. You're voting for Rich Negrin. Who else should I vote for? Yeah, there's Rebecca Reinhardt. Rich Negrin supports her. So that was a very successful strategy, not the only one, but it was really a critical, sort of a key part of the overall strategy. Next. And in thinking about, what made a difference and what frequently makes a difference in these upset elections, one is identity, having a real identity that makes you different from, makes you stand out. Being a lifelong Philadelphia, married with kids in public school, member of community groups, it's not enough. It has to be compelling. And in this election, the issue of identity apparently was compelling. Look at that interesting quote from Larry Platt. Again, There's a lot of good things to be said about Alan Buckowitz, but next slide. For somebody that didn't have all that background, which one of these two is the traditional politician and which one of them is the newcomer to politics? And remember, this is a few months after the 2016 presidential election. Next. So that made a huge difference. And again, being a lifelong Philadelphia, good family person and so on, not enough. You have to be a compelling alternative to the status quo. Next. Look at that. That's what Vega told the Inquirer. This is not a good statement for a challenger to be making. So I think that's sort of the appearance that Vega really didn't stand for much and had this affiliation with the FOP. Those were the kinds of things that made it hard for him to gain any traction. Next. Secondly, education, educating the voters. Again, educating them about the issues that you care about to make them feel compelled to do something about them. That is, vote for you. What a great quote from David Richardson. Registering someone to vote without educating them is like giving somebody a driver's license without teaching them how to drive. Next. So you've got to put yourself in a position where people not only think, that's a good person. I saw that person. Person visited candidates night. You've got to make them passionately care. Next. Look at this. This is from 1982. Joe Vignola, at that time a ward leader in South Philadelphia, talking to his neighbors. I know the pride you felt about Frank Rizzo, first Italian-American mayor, and how you felt when people started taking shots at him. Think about that sort of defensive thing, the grievance thing that was a factor in some recent elections that you're familiar with. We should feel the same pride now. This is the first Italian-American congressman we've ever had. This statement was not about Italian-American pride. It was about re-electing a former Republican, Tom Foglietta, in Democratic-dominated South Philadelphia. Why would Vignola do that? Some of you may remember Abscam in 1980. The problem that Vignola faced at that time was that in that year, the endorsed Democratic candidate for Congress was Ozzie Myers, featured in the Abscam sting. And so Vignola, with a cabal of others, including Neil Oxman, famed media consultant, really developed a clever strategy that involved convincing voters to split their tickets and vote straight Democrat, except for Congress. And in that case, vote for Foglietta. And it worked. Foglietta won decisively, and he won again and again in that seat until being appointed ambassador to Italy. Next. And then the third question, the big question, is party. What is the Democratic City Committee doing? Look at Bob Reddy. He's been around since 1986. If he doesn't like you, he'll punch you in the face. What is he going to do about you and your good intentions to get elected or support the election of somebody you care about? Next. That's the real key. Are they going to make a move, or are they going to just let nature take its course? There was no Democratic City Committee endorsement in the DA race this time or last time. They didn't do anything. So individual ward leaders made their own decisions about who to support. Next. But look what happened. Ron Donatucci, a Democratic Party stalwart, since way back in the 20th century, elected and re-elected Register of Wills in a ward in South Philadelphia where he was ward leader. Next. In 2019, he was beaten handily by Tracy Gordon. This is a guy who commanded the respect of veteran ward leaders and Democratic City Committee insiders. But he was beaten and it wasn't even close. Next. So what is it with this party, which in some cases can be very strong, and dominate a race, and in other cases doesn't seem to be capable of doing some basic things? Former House Speaker Bob O'Donnell had a Yoda-like pronouncement to make on this. You know, the party's kind of like a place where people get together. They don't really pick somebody, they just get together. That's how the party works. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of a figurative term, I think, like the term real estate market. You know, there's no physical place that's the real estate market. There are people that make investments, sometimes big investments, sometimes stupid investments. And there are certain ways in which you can be successful in the real estate market and some ways in which you can make stupid mistakes. And something similar is going on with respect to this idea of the party. You know, if you consider it as kind of a figurative term that's similar to similar terms, again, like the real estate market, that may be a way to think about it. Next. And so the question that comes to mind, to my mind at least, is should we try to get rid of the party, the Democratic Party, or is it better to try to work within the party to improve it? And it's really interesting when you think about the ward and division system. It's very democratic, although it may not seem that way now. It's very grassroots and very supportive of the idea of representative democracy. Take a division where I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. You know, it's a very small area. Look at that, it's between 36th and 40th. You could walk every block in that area in a few hours. And every 4 years, 2 Democrats who live in the area are elected as committee persons for that area. And their job is to represent that small area in Democratic City Committee and to help educate voters about how to register and about candidates that are running and to help the party on election day. Next. And so after election day, after the primary election day, when those 2 committee people are elected, they get together with their counterparts, you know, pairs of committee people from other divisions in the ward, and they elect a ward leader. And there's the 27th ward where Penn is located. Again, it's a little bigger, but it's not huge. The people who are going to show up as other elected committee people are going to be different from you. And this is a very diverse ward in some respects, which includes heavily Penn influenced, but also includes some high poverty, low income areas, some areas that are not doing as well, some areas that have serious problems with crime. So they elect a ward leader, and then next. And then all the ward leaders get together and elect a head of city committee. So if you think about that sort of grassroots thing that starts with 2 committee people in a very compact neighborhood and gets to a citywide structure, that to me is very conducive with representative government and democracy. Next. So what's wrong? You know, is there some flaw that I've overlooked that's the real problem with the system? Or is the problem with too many of the wrong people are involved? And we've got to get rid of them. And when I say the wrong people, it's not like, you know, some group of elites should be chosen to replace them. A lot of the right people are in committee person seats right now. You guys are some of them, I know, and they do everything that you would want someone to do to get out the vote and to educate voters about what's going on. So there may be an opportunity to start make changes at the grassroots level. And that's what Nikhil Sabal did in the 2nd ward, which is basically Queen Village and some of Pennsport. They turned out candidates for the committee person seats, and they took over a ward that had previously been headed by Joe Vignola 40 years ago. Next. Let's look at the other day. There's the citywide results you probably saw in the paper. It looks pretty good in terms of Vega. If you just consider the geography, you know, he lost, but he got a majority in a number of wards: Northeast Philadelphia, parts of Kensington, the River wards, and South Philadelphia. Next. But if you look at the wards individually, you can see what happened. The 66th ward, the far northeast, very FOP dominated, and Vega led by 3,000 plus points. Next. And something similar at the opposite end of the city, 2,000 votes compared to a little over 700. The 26th ward is the ward that Donatucci had been ward leader for until he passed away a few years ago. But it's also a ward that voted for Sanders in the presidential primary before this past one. Next. However, Krasner really did very well in a lot of the other places and extremely well in some of them. There's the 8th ward, some of you live there, and he got roughly double Vega's votes. I think this is one indicator of the fact that Ed Rendell's endorsement of Vega didn't carry a lot of weight. If it did, then I think you'd see much better results for Vega in the 8th ward. Next. Something similar in the 46th ward, where Rick Krajewski is the House member. Nearly 10 times the Vega's votes turned out for Krasner. Next. And then although you might think that the Latino vote would make some difference, the Latino wards are low turnout wards. And here's an example. Fewer than 600 voters turned out, and it was roughly split between the two candidates. Next. So look at that picture. If you're a really, really inspiring picture. There are a lot of things that are happening now. This is an exciting time to be in Philadelphia. It's not as that exciting on a national level in some respects, where we're seeing stalemates, but it's very exciting locally and to some extent at the state level. Next. And if you think about next year, a year from now, all of the committee people will be running, all of the committee person slots will be on the ballot. So you can run, or somebody can run. You can go to the Committee of 70 website and find out who your committee people are and decide if you want to make some changes. They're all going to be elected or re-elected, and all of them are going to get together and re-elect or replace all of the city's ward leaders. So that's an opportunity. Next. And I wrote this book, Philadelphia Battlefields. It includes case studies of a number of upset elections. Look at Ed Rendell in the lower left-hand corner, a little skinnier then. And again, applies mapping and some of the election data, which is very readily available thanks to the city commissioners, and some analysis of other things that were going on at the time of the election to analyze about 50 years worth of elections, ending with the 2019 primary. So that's my story. Thanks very much for listening, and we've got time for some questions.
Okay. We had, if anyone who was on PC,
Linda may want to turn off your video.
Last month knows that we were bombed. As a result, we were trying to eliminate that problem. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
Sorry.
now.
Computer connection. Anyone who was on, okay. Last month we were bombed, so we were being very cautious. As a result, somehow we've disabled chat. I have a couple questions to start it off, and Tom's going to give you an email address where you can email questions to him. Go ahead, Tom, give the address.
Yeah, so
Tom?
sorry about this, everyone. The chat got disabled, and it was hard for us to get it back.
Just have us raise our hands.
Yeah, so you can raise your hands if we can see you. You have to turn your video on and raise your hand, and we'll try to do it that way. Or you can send an email to, you ready? phillypolicy@gmail.org. That's our email address, and we will. I'm looking at that. So if you want to get my attention that way, so sorry about that. But let's. Linda had some questions to start, and then
I have a couple of questions to kick it off, and then I'll be looking. Then Tom, you want to look for the hands or me? No, you're looking at emails. I'll look for the hands. Okay. So I think a good question to start with is your expectations regarding political activism in Philly, and because this book is about Philly. And if you want to opine Pennsylvania or otherwise, that's fine too. But what do you think is going to happen? I know we were all came out in large numbers for the election against Trump, but what happens next?
Well, I think the phenomenon to focus on, one of them, is the Working Families Party, which elected a member of city council at large in the last election by winning one of the states which traditionally had gone to a Republican candidate. So they've certainly made some inroads that no other party had been able to do. The second phenomenon to look at, I think, is the Reclaim Philadelphia gang, who again, took over two very well-established, very traditional political wards, the first and the second, in South Philadelphia, and are now starting to make moves elsewhere. So I really like that, because their approach is that traditional approach of taking over the party structure and making it work in the way that we idealistic people feel it should. I think in Pennsylvania, with redistricting and the reapportionment process, this year being a fair one, and it's going to be very fair with respect to the House and Senate districts in the state. There are big opportunities to flip seats that have been held by Republicans who benefited from gerrymandering. I have a lot of experience in Berks County, where Reading is located, and I'm going to be helping a couple of candidates for the State House next year to try to support that. Philadelphia already has a lot of people like us supporting people that we think are the right people. But there are a lot of people like us who live in Reading, in Allentown, in Altoona, and Erie. I've been to those places. They all want better public schools. They all care about the opportunities for their children in the workplace. They care about the opioid epidemic and crime. There's a lot going on in those places that's identical to what we care about. So learning more about what's happening in small cities in Pennsylvania and those other areas that have so much in common with us, I think is something else to consider.
Can you hear me now, John? So first of all, for the audience, I had the pleasure and opportunity of reading John's book, which I highly recommend for anybody interested in Philly politics. So I'm going to ask you a question related directly to the book. You did a comparison of wards, and I'm curious as to how you decided on which wards you wanted to talk about. How did you pick them? What was the criteria?
There's one chapter of the book that is called The Perfect Ward, and it is based on conversations with the ward leaders who describe, their background, how they got to be a ward leader, how the ward meeting is conducted. There are 66 ward leaders. Guess how many might be interested in talking with John Kromer? Maybe not a lot of them, but serendipitously, the ones that I wanted to talk with were available. One was Nikhil Saval. He was ward leader in the second ward when the Reclaim people took over. He resigned to run for the state Senate, but he was available then. And so we had coffee and I got a rundown of what was happening there. Marion Tasco's ward, now led by Sherelle Parker in Mount Airy, is a high turnout ward. It has had that reputation for ages. And so Marion Tasco was kind enough to tell me about her background, which is fascinating, growing up in segregated Greensboro, North Carolina, and coming here to finish her college education and becoming affiliated with Bill Gray really at the very beginning. And then describing how with Sherelle Parker, how the ward meetings are conducted, a very open process, a lot of investigation of who the candidates are, and what's in it for us as a community, which is really admirable. And that's reflected in the high turnouts that war generates. And then I had the opportunity to get acquainted with Gregory Benjamin, who is war leader of the 51st Ward, which is west of 50th Street, south of Pine Street, that area that's on the fringes of the Penn area, but it also includes some neighborhoods that are in trouble in terms of crime, drugs, unemployment, poor quality of life, and got some good insights from him about how he's made his way in that environment in which he does not have the clout of Marion Tasco or Sherelle Parker. So it was just by chance and partly based on people that I knew, but I was lucky.
Linda, there is a hand raised. So I see apparently the hand raise functions work. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right.
Catherine Dowdle has a question.
Linda Bernstein.
Oh, go ahead, Linda.
You want to unmute Linda Bernstein?
Linda.
Hi, John. I'm still stuck on the Reinhardt unseating Butkovitz election. First of all, I thought your program presentation was fascinating. But how do you think Reinhardt, I mean, the key you said was she got on all those other sample ballots, but what possessed those candidates to put her on instead of Butkovitz? Do you have any insight into that? Because obviously, as you say, that's what enabled her to upset him.
I think one important factor, again, was the climate after the presidential election. And I'm sure you all remember, that feeling, and also remember hearing about the women who decided to run for office and who were incredibly successful. Again, first-time candidates who overthrew longtime incumbents. I think there was a feeling on the part of those candidates and their supporters of, I've got to do something. This time, I've really got to do something, and of making a big commitment of time and energy. Again, at the grassroots, these upsets were not lavishly funded for the most part. But I think that we have Donald Trump to thank for that, ironically, and that helped. I think also, the fact that Reinhardt had experience in city government. She was known by people who knew her and knew of her as kind of a straight shooter, as somebody who could deal with angry city council members. She came from Center City. There's a network in Center City that's easier to communicate with. And I think a lot of people in that network knew who she was. But I think the post-presidential election phenomenon was by far the biggest factor.
Linda, there's a couple of people hands raised.
Tom, did you get any? Because I do have another question if you didn't get any questions.
Okay,
Tom?
well, yeah, so we have a couple of hands raised. Yeah, sorry, Linda, you might want to turn your camera off because you're breaking up.
Oh, okay.
So we
All right.
Catherine, who was next? Catherine Dowdle was next. I'm gonna go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thanks. Hi, John. How are you?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too. And I want to point out, I'm sitting in the breakout room on the 3rd floor of the firehouse. So for those of you who may not know, one of John's earlier West Philly projects was the conversion of a firehouse into first a farmer's market, and now it's a restaurant and bike shop and co-working space. I just want to, Linda had a very similar question to mine, and I wanted to ask if you're really considering gender when you're looking at what makes somebody a new face in the political world. I think that Rebecca Reinhardt had two things. I think the fact that a lot of women, certainly all my friends, who had just watched Hillary get the pants beaten off of her for reasons that I think were 99% sexism and maybe 1% something else, are really trying to support women candidates because they do have so many things stacked against them. And then I also think, the point that she had experience in city government, that was a huge anti-incumbent election that year, as I recall. And there were, I know a friend of mine who'd been a committee person was encouraging other people to run for committee people. And she was so encouraging that she got voted out. and there were a couple of long-term good committee people that were at that same risk. So I think that general anti-incumbent wave combined with the sexism piece in that particular election were important. I guess I'm curious to know how you see the progressive, the sort of the working family. I'm wondering now that, Krasner swept in on a wave of On the New Kid on the Block. The progressives have swept in on the wave of We're the New Kids on the Block. How do you see them then honing their message when in the next couple of elections, they're suddenly not the new kids on the block anymore?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but looking at the Rick Krajewski thing and all those voters who suddenly appeared, who had never been active before, I think what we older people are not seeing is the growing interest on the part of people who are much younger than we are, who are actively getting involved in ways that we're not aware of, because we're used to looking at the Inquirer editorial page or listening to WHYY. Not that those aren't wonderful things to do, but what's going on in social media, that none of us understand very well, and the kinds of communications that are taking place there, I think are making a huge difference. And clearly this generation is unhappy. They're furious about, climate change and what they're seeing with respect to racial discrimination, college debt, the ability to become a homeowner. They're aware of this stuff, despite what we may, despite our lack of awareness of them. And I think the Krajewski results showed that candidates who know that generation and know how to communicate with them through social media, but not only through social media, are going to be the key to generating a lot more interest. There's one chapter in the book about the Black Power movement in which, starting in the 1970s, Black people became increasingly aware that their elected officials were white, mostly older white men. And so through Hardy Williams and others, David Richardson among them, there was a big citywide push to elect Black people to offices that had previously been represented by white people. And again, there was a sense of urgency that I think a lot of Black people felt of, I really need to be doing something about this. This is the time for me to be doing something about this. So I think something's going on, something similar is going on with respect to the newest generation.
Great, thanks.
Which is
great talk. I look forward to reading the book. Thanks, John.
Mary, I saw your hand up. Mary, go ahead. I'll unmute you. Tom, can you unmute Mary Goldman?
Mary, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, there I go. I live in the 27th, and John's done a fine job. Linda's husband, Linda and Mark, used to live in the 27th. The reform kind of politics really started way back in the 60s, at least out here. Part of it is when you talk about the first and second wards, for instance, it's a gentrification situation. It partly was probably in the 27th also, but we started trying to change things in the 60s, and African Americans and whites and people tried to get together to begin to change things. Hardy Williams ran for mayor in 71. The 27th ward became an independent ward in 71. But we've been working on changing the committee people in the 46th, before in 68, I guess it was 70, I'm not sure the dates anymore. And you're right, the committee people can elect ward leaders, but they're mostly no committee people elected anymore around the city. And sustaining the young people, the 27th ward, much of that part you talked about at Penn, that looked like a compact little area you could cover so easily. There were 3,000 people live on the 3800 block of Locust Walk because there are 3 high rises. And so you can't do it. And they don't sustain it. You can't find these kids, can't sustain it. So it's great that Reclaim is doing it. And Krajewski surely won by a lot of votes, but that was the presidential primary. So you can't just say it was Reclaim and the new stuff going on, because, and also Jim Roebuck, whom we all love dearly, was getting to be a senior person, and people thought maybe change was available. And the women taking over, I think, is also a critical thing, probably with Tracy Gordon as well as with Reinhardt. So it's really complicated, and it would be fabulous, as you say, if everybody would run for committee persons and change the whole universe. But I don't think I'll live that long.
Well, here's the life is unfair comment associated with that. Remember the turnout numbers on the slides for Vega versus Krasner? Huge in Center City, huge in far northeast and far southwest, minuscule in one of the Latino wards. So if you're a candidate for office, for citywide office, you might not even go to the 7th ward. You might skip it altogether, thinking pragmatically in terms of what is it going to take to get elected. You might not go there at all. That's the unpleasant truth. But the reality is, and you can look at the election results from past years, some of the high turnout wards, like Cheryl Parker's ward, like the 8th ward, the 46th, routinely generate the most votes in every election. And the turnout from one of those wards, in some cases, is equal to the turnout from 12 low turnout wards. So it's unequal across the city, and high turnout wards carry a lot more influence than most other wards. So if you focus first on electing committee people from the high turnout wards, that's a good start. And this is not my brilliant idea. That's been happening for years.
Do you think that the wards will ever be realigned? Because, a lot of those wards actually, North Philly has lost population too. And the building of new buildings in Center City and West Philly is huge. So the population is going to go way up.
Yeah. The ward boundaries are terrible. They were last redrawn in 1967. And I'm sure it would be incredibly controversial to try to redraw them again. But division boundaries change with the census. So that, again, will have to be where the focus is, I think.
They may, yeah.
Robert Sutton had a question. Should we let him get in there?
Okay, Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering, John, if you could talk about the relationship of Philadelphia change forces to those nationally. How much of the Reclaim movement and the Working Family Party is focused just on Philadelphia area issues, and how much is it related to nationwide issues and similar work going on in other cities? How do you see these changes as unique to Philadelphia or common elsewhere?
I'm just guessing, and I've been spending all my time focusing on Philadelphia, so I'm really kind of out of touch with respect to the rest of the world. But I think it's fair to say it is happening in other cities. These organizations, Reclaim, for example, Indivisible, they've got a national agenda. I think in some cases it's working very effectively, as in Philadelphia. In other cases, it may not be as far advanced. I'm interested in Camden, New Jersey. I love Camden. I worked there. I ran the redevelopment agency for a couple of years. But that's an area where I think there might be an opportunity to put together a coalition. But so some of these strategies are going to take time to implement. Others, I think, will produce the kind of overnight successes that I was talking about earlier. So the answer to your question is, I don't know. But if there was ever a time of opportunity, this is the time. All of the chaos that's been going on in the past years, I think, has stimulated a lot of activism, which is super. And we allegedly smart people have an opportunity to influence how that plays out.
I don't see any other hands.
Other hands? Do you have any written questions? Then I'd like to do the final question if you have nothing.
There was one from Mary again.
John. Oh, Mary has another question? Unmute yourself, Mary. Mary, unmute yourself. Okay.
Is okay. There
Is
you
that
go.
okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
John, I'm interested in, did you say that the divisions were being withdrawn based on populations, but the wards were not?
The wards are not. My understanding is that with the census, there is a redistricting that includes the divisions and also the council, the district council seats.
But if the party is a private organization, not a government entity, are they required to redraw district division boundaries based on population?
Well, the Committee of 70 had a lawsuit at one point to make the divisions at 500 people. The wards used to be 25,000 people. I don't know what they are now. So they got redrawn. When did you say? I don't know. But that was a Committee of 70 lawsuit to make them be 500 people.
Judge Bernstein can clear all this up.
I don't know.
Because
Yeah. Unmute.
it's silly to,
Thank you.
it's silly to redraw divisions and not redraw wards.
Why?
Redrawing the wards requires state action, but redrawing divisions is done by petition to the city commissioners. When I was deputy commissioner to Tasco, the 52nd ward and the 38th ward, which were gotten heavily black, somehow or other, there were dead divisions that we could never get redrawn to be more equitable. I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, because I was a judge for 30 years, that there's any requirement to redistrict, but at least reasonable ward leaders try to do that because it's easier to manage and get out the vote. I have a question for you, John, if I can. Do you have any comments on this past election, the judicial races, and particularly Michelle Hangley seemingly beating the party?
Oh, great.
I don't, but I think you should comment on that, being closer to the action.
Well, I just think it's worth noting that Tiffany Palmer beat the party 2 years ago, and Michelle Hangley beat the party, hopefully, fingers crossed, this year with the same coalition of progressives basically driving the whole show. So it fits in with what you've been saying.
Did a lot of the women win? Did a lot of the women win?
There were quite a few women, but they were all party endorsed. The only one who snuck in and beat the party appears to be Michelle. But Reclaim basically, there was a lot of overlap with the party and with Reclaim, and I don't know who else's ballots. Well, but she's ahead by 2,000 votes now, so it seems like she's probably going to make it.
But the really discouraging thing are the amendments statewide, and that's why things like Turn PA Blue is so very important. John spoke about Berks County and all that. The only thing we really could do, John, is to all of us move out of Philadelphia and go live in other places if we really want to help the world change. But in the meantime, Turn PA Blue is
And change PA.
And change PA are things to be involved with, and indivisible.
Well, my preference is we all move to Wyoming and then turn all the seats, and then 4 years later we can all come back. So this is a fairly small sacrifice for all of us to make.
Right.
Right. That's,
John, I don't know how we never got you involved in Change PA, but you have fabulous analyses about how a new candidate on the scene can change a legislative district. I really want to make contact with you after this and get you involved.
And Turn PA Blue mentioned before.
Not Turn PA Blue, Change PA. We elect money to represent, we raise money for seats out of Philadelphia to flip from red to blue. And we had a lot of success 4 years ago. And then last time we had very little success. So we need some more thinking and some good analysis like you did.
Well, I mentioned Turn PA Blue because it's sort of related to that. They did a winter series of Zoom sessions that was very sophisticated in terms of getting expertise from various quarters about campaign financing, the use of social media, organizing a campaign. It was quite good. So somebody's putting a lot of effort into that, which I hope will produce some results along with Change PA's resources.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
Thank you, Linda. John, this is worked out much better than I expected. This was fascinating. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that everybody on this Zoom buys your book because they will love it.
How do we get a copy?
And everybody have a good summer.